There is a photograph from April 1956 that most of the world has seen. A young woman in a breathtaking gown, walking toward the altar of a tiny European principality while 30 million people watched. She looked as though she had stepped out of a storybook. But the storybook was only part of the story. There were 3 sisters in that Philadelphia family. One became a princess. The others lived lives just as dramatic, and far more painful. Let's go back to the beginning. To the house on Henry Avenue. The Kelly family home sat at 3901 Henry Avenue in East Falls, a neighborhood in the northwest of Philadelphia, perched on a hill above the Schuylkill River. Jack Kelly built it in 1929, the same year Grace was born, out of brick, naturally, because bricks were the thing that had made the Kellys rich. John Brendan Kelly Sr. was one of the most extraordinary men in Philadelphia history, and he knew it. Born in 1889, one of 10 children of Irish immigrant parents from County Mayo, he came up the hard way. He apprenticed as a bricklayer in his brother's construction firm, working with his hands, learning the trade from the ground up. But Jack Kelly wasn't going to remain someone else's employee. In 1919, after serving as a lieutenant in the United States Army during the First World War, he founded his own contracting company, John B. Kelly Incorporated, borrowing just $7,000 from his brothers George and Walter to do it. Within a decade, Kelly for Brickwork was one of the largest construction outfits on the East Coast. And then there was the rowing. Jack Kelly was not merely a successful businessman. He was arguably the greatest amateur rower America had ever produced. He won 126 consecutive races in the single scull, dominating his sport throughout the late 1910s and early 1920s. In 1920, he applied to compete in the Diamond Sculls at the Henley Royal Regatta on the Thames, the most prestigious event in rowing. The organizers rejected him. The official reason cited a dispute with his rowing club, but the widely understood truth was that the Henley Committee considered him unacceptable because he had worked as a manual laborer, a bricklayer, and was therefore not a gentleman in the British sense of the word. They would not let an Irish Catholic tradesman's son into their race. Jack Kelly responded by going to the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp and winning the gold medal in both the single sculls and the double sculls in a single afternoon, defeating the British sculler Jack Beresford, who had won the diamond sculls that very same year. Afterward, Kelly sent his racing cap to King George V with a short note. He won another gold in Paris in 1924, becoming the first rower in history to win 3 Olympic gold medals. It was the kind of story Americans loved. The working man who took his revenge not through anger but through excellence, making the establishment look foolish in the process. That was Jack Kelly. And that was the air his children breathed. He married Margaret Major in 1924. She was the daughter of German immigrants, a former competitive swimmer, and the first woman ever to coach women's athletics at the University of Pennsylvania. She was striking, intelligent, and demanding, qualities she passed on to all 4 of her children. Together, Jack and Margaret had Peggy in 1925, Jack Jr. in 1927, Grace in 1929, and Lizanne in 1933. The house on Henry Avenue, with its 17 rooms, became the center of a family universe that was ambitious, athletic, and relentlessly performance-oriented. Growing up there was not, by any account, a soft experience. Margaret Kelly ran a tight ship, her discipline firm to the point of severity. Jack Sr. was the kind of father who was proud of his children in the aggregate, but attentive to them individually only in proportion to what they produced. Peggy was his favorite, the eldest, the most socially brilliant, the one who effortlessly commanded a room. Kel, as Jack Jr. was known, was groomed to carry the athletic legacy forward, and he did. He competed at the Olympics 4 times, won a bronze medal at Melbourne in 1956, and later became president of the U.S. Olympic Committee. Lizanne, the youngest, was adored simply for being the baby. And then there was Grace. Grace was the middle child in nearly every sense. Not the firstborn, not the only son, not the youngest. She was a quiet, somewhat introverted girl who suffered from sinusitis and who spent much of her childhood feeling just slightly outside the family's main spotlight. Her father considered acting an unserious profession, and when Grace announced her intention to pursue it, his response was one of amused dismissal rather than encouragement. On the night she won her Academy Award in 1955, Jack Kelly reportedly remarked to friends that of all his children, Grace was the last one he would have expected to amount to much. She spent years trying to change his mind. She never entirely succeeded. The uncle who mattered most to Grace was George Kelly, Jack's brother, a playwright of real distinction who had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1926 for his play Craig's Wife. George was a brilliant, theatrical, deeply complicated figure, widely rumored to be gay at a time when that was not something one discussed openly, and utterly devoted to his craft. He encouraged Grace, took her creative ambitions seriously, and gave her a model for what artistic dedication could look like. Grace graduated from Stevens School in Philadelphia in May 1947 and promptly left for New York, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Her parents offered no financial support. She supplemented her studies with modeling work, cigarette advertisements, magazine spreads. She was 21 when she made her Broadway debut, 22 when she landed her first film role in the 1951 picture 14 Hours, and 23 when she played Gary Cooper's Quaker wife in High Noon, a role that planted her firmly on Hollywood's radar. What happened next happened very fast. Within 3 years of her film debut, Grace Kelly was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. She worked repeatedly with Alfred Hitchcock on Dial M for Murder and Rear Window, both in 1954, and won the Academy Award for Best Actress for The Country Girl the same year. By 1955, she was as luminous and bankable as any actress in the world. None of which impressed her father nearly enough. But back in Philadelphia, her sisters were living their own lives. And those lives were about to become complicated in very different ways. Before we reach Grace's story in Monaco, it's worth understanding what happened to the sister who never left. The one who stayed behind and paid a price the movie magazines never talked about. Margaret Catherine Kelly, known to everyone as Peggy, was born on June 13, 1925, and by most accounts she was the beauty of the family. After Grace became famous, those who had known both sisters often remarked that Peggy had been considered even more striking than Grace. More vibrant, more socially magnetic, more immediately present in a room. She was the Kelly their father openly favored. She was the one everyone expected to have the brilliant future. She attended Ravenhill Academy, then Stevens Academy in Germantown, then spent a year at Marjorie Webster Junior College in Washington, D.C. She was charming. She was witty. She was everything the Philadelphia society world of the late 1940s prized. When Prince Rainier III of Monaco married Grace in April 1956, Peggy stood as matron of honor. When the palace floated the idea of bestowing titles on the American Kellys, Peggy's response was characteristically dry. She declared she wanted to go home as a plain American citizen, and wondered what on earth their friends in Philadelphia would say if the Kellys came back as dukes and countesses. She was funny. She was sharp. And behind that brightness, her life was falling apart in slow motion. Peggy's first marriage was to George Davis Jr. They had twin daughters together, Margaret and Mary Lee. The marriage ended in divorce in 1959. In an era when divorce still carried genuine social stigma, particularly within the tight-knit Catholic circles of Philadelphia's established families, this alone was its own kind of wound. She remarried, this time to a man named Eugene Conlon. That marriage ended too. 2 marriages. 2 divorces. And then, in September 1963, came something worse. Peggy's 15-year-old daughter Mary Lee disappeared. She had run away with her 18-year-old boyfriend, John Paul Jones Jr., and the two of them drove all the way to Des Moines, Iowa. They were missing for a month. When the family finally located them, the situation was exactly what it appeared to be. The girl was working as a waitress in Iowa, and the two of them intended to get married. They did eventually, though Peggy did not attend the wedding. The child who had been a flower girl at Princess Grace's fairy tale wedding in Monaco had run away from home 8 years later to elope with a teenager in the middle of Iowa. It is difficult to overstate what that must have cost Peggy. The humiliation. The helplessness. The very public nature of it, because by 1963 the Kelly name was famous and there was no keeping that kind of story quiet. And it arrived on top of everything else she had already been through. The divorces, the long shadow of her younger sister's fame, the years of watching the world celebrate Grace while Peggy remained largely invisible to it. By the late 1960s and through the 1970s, Peggy was struggling in ways that people around her noticed but rarely discussed openly. The drinking had become serious. The life she had tried to build was crumbling piece by piece. On May 2, 1985, her second husband, Eugene Conlon, died. By grim coincidence, her brother Jack Jr., Kel, died the same day of a fatal heart attack while jogging along the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. He was 57 years old. Two losses, one afternoon. Peggy Kelly Conlon died on November 23, 1991, in Philadelphia. She was 65 years old. Those who wrote honestly about the family noted that her death was the final chapter of a long decline driven, in significant part, by alcohol. She was buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Cheltenham Township, not far from where she had grown up. Her obituary was gracious and careful. It noted her charitable work, her love of swimming and diving, and the fact that those who had known both Peggy and Grace had considered Peggy the more beautiful of the two. It was the kind of obituary that carries its grief in the spaces between the words. Grace had been dead 9 years by then. There were no cameras at Peggy's funeral. No 30 million people watching on television. By the spring of 1955, Grace Kelly was at the absolute peak of her Hollywood career. An Academy Award in hand, Hitchcock's preferred leading lady, a star by any measure. It was in this moment, during the Cannes Film Festival that May, that a photo session was arranged at the Palace of Monaco. Rainier III, the sovereign prince of a principality of fewer than 20,000 people, had been looking for a wife. The palace arranged a meeting. Grace arrived in a floral dress, her still wet hair twisted into an improvised updo, and the two of them toured the palace gardens while photographers captured the occasion for Paris Match. Whether it was love at first sight is a matter of some debate. What is clear is that Rainier was under genuine pressure. Monaco's treasury was dangerously depleted. The tiny casino state, once the playground of European aristocracy, was losing business to new gambling establishments across the French border. Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate with significant financial interests in the principality, was among those urging the prince to find a high-profile wife who could put Monaco back on the global map, attract press, attract tourists, attract investment. A Hollywood actress of the first rank was exactly what the principality needed. Rainier corresponded with Grace by letter for months after their Cannes meeting. He sailed to New York in December 1955 and visited the Kelly family in Philadelphia. On Christmas Day, he proposed. The engagement was announced formally on January 5, 1956. The world went slightly mad. But the wedding came with conditions that the press of 1956 largely glossed over in its enthusiasm for the romance. The Kelly family was required to pay a dowry, reportedly $2 million, to the House of Grimaldi before the marriage could proceed. Jack Kelly was reportedly furious, telling people his daughter didn't need to pay any man to marry her. But Grace wanted this, and eventually her father relented. Half the dowry came from her own Hollywood earnings. The rest came from the Kelly family fortune, the brickwork money, the construction contracts, the sweat of a man who had built an empire from nothing so that his children would never have to struggle the way he had. Now it was being handed to a European prince. The wedding unfolded over 2 days. The civil ceremony in the throne room of the prince's palace on April 18, 1956, followed by the religious ceremony at St. Nicholas Cathedral the following day. The gown, designed by MGM costume designer Helen Rose and given to Grace by the studio in exchange for broadcast rights, was made from 125-year-old Brussels lace, silk taffeta, and thousands of hand-sewn pearls. It took 6 weeks and 3 dozen seamstresses to complete. It is still considered one of the most beautiful wedding gowns ever made. 30 million people watched on television. 900 reporters covered the event on the ground. Prince Rainier himself later described the whole spectacle as the biggest circus in history, and said the two of them should have just gone to a small chapel in the mountains and been done with it quietly. Grace Kelly was 26 years old. She was surrendering her film career, her American life, her independence, and her privacy. In exchange, she received a title, a palace, and a husband 12 years her senior who would never be easy. She stepped through the door of that other life and let it close behind her. Monaco in 1956 was a place with very fixed ideas about itself. The Grimaldi family had ruled the principality for centuries. It had its protocols, its courtiers, its established social order, and a deeply held sense of propriety. Into this world arrived the Kelly family, Irish Catholic, self-made, American to their bones, and entirely unashamed of it. Grace's mother, Margaret, was a presence in Monaco from the very beginning, and she was not what the palace crowd had expected. Confident, forthright, and thoroughly unimpressed by European aristocratic pretension, she made her opinions known in ways that raised eyebrows throughout the Monegasque court. She was also, by many accounts, a complicated mother-in-law, someone who never entirely stopped seeing Grace as her daughter first and a princess second. Grace had spent her Hollywood years working hard to separate herself from her family's complicated dynamics, to become her own person, to earn a reputation on her own terms. Being Princess of Monaco gave her a new identity. But it also meant her family, with all its dramas and difficulties, had access to the palace and to the press corps that constantly surrounded it. And the press was always watching. Monaco, by its very nature, could never be a private kingdom. Photographers trailed Grace everywhere. Every visiting family member was photographed and speculated about. The palace walls offered no real protection at all. Nor did they protect her creative life. Alfred Hitchcock approached Grace in 1962 about starring in Marnie, a role she reportedly wanted badly. The public opposition within Monaco was so intense that she ultimately withdrew. She joined the board of 20th Century Fox in 1976. She narrated documentaries, gave poetry readings across Europe. Small gestures toward the creative life she had surrendered, but the film career was gone. She had traded it for the title, and the title was non-negotiable. What Grace found instead was purpose. She threw herself into charitable work with a sincerity that surprised those who expected a movie star playing at philanthropy. She became president of the Red Cross of Monaco. She founded what became the Princess Grace Foundation to support emerging artists in America. She established Aide Mondiale, a Monaco-based children's rights organization recognized by the United Nations. She was genuinely good at being a princess in the ways that mattered beyond the pageantry. But Monaco was a small world, and in small worlds, everything is felt more intensely. The tensions in her marriage were real. Rainier could be brusque, controlling, and difficult. Their 3 children, Caroline, born January 1957, Albert, born March 1958, and Stephanie, born February 1965, grew up inside a dynamic that was by turns warm and strained. Grace found solace in friendships with artists and writers, in pressing flowers, in the quiet beauty of domestic life rendered with care. In her later years, she published a book about flowers and their symbolism. It was not the same as acting, but it was something of her own. She kept her American passport throughout. She maintained her dual citizenship by quiet insistence. In 1976, she bought back a piece of her father's ancestral land in County Mayo, Ireland, a gesture toward the roots that had made the Kellys who they were. She never entirely let go of the Philadelphia girl underneath the princess. Grace had spent the summer of 1982 at Rock Agel, the family's farmhouse retreat just above Monaco on the French side of the border. By her daughter Caroline's later account, Grace had been exhausted that summer but had not slowed down, because slowing down was not something Grace Kelly permitted herself. On the morning of September 13, 1982, she was driving back to Monaco in her 1972 Rover. Her youngest daughter, Stephanie, 17 years old, was in the passenger seat. They were heading into Monaco for the start of the school season. The road from Rock Agel to Monaco is one of those impossibly narrow mountain routes that winds down through the hills above the Côte d'Azur in a series of tight, dizzying curves. Grace had driven it many times. She knew it, and she hated driving. After a minor accident in Monaco in the 1970s, she had expressed a preference for using a chauffeur. On this particular morning, however, the car was too small to accommodate both of them, their luggage, and a driver. So Grace took the wheel. A witness driving behind them on the D37 reported that the Rover suddenly began swerving violently across both lanes, then straightened out and accelerated into the bend ahead. There were no brake lights. The car did not slow. It launched off the road and tumbled roughly 30 meters down the mountainside. Stephanie survived. She had a fractured vertebra and a concussion but was otherwise physically intact. Grace was found unconscious in the wreckage with severe brain injuries, chest trauma, and a fractured femur. She was taken by ambulance to the hospital in Monaco. The initial palace statement was careful, broken bones, the suggestion of a full recovery. The truth that the doctors understood, almost immediately, was far more serious. Grace had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, a catastrophic bleed inside the brain that had almost certainly begun before the car left the road. The hemorrhage, they concluded, was what caused her to lose control. A second, more severe bleed followed at the hospital. She was declared brain dead. Prince Rainier, along with Caroline and Albert, made the decision to remove her from life support. At 10:55 p.m. on September 14, 1982, Grace Patricia Kelly died. She was 52 years old. Nearly 100 million people watched the funeral on September 18. The same cathedral where she had been married 26 years earlier. The same stones where her children had been baptized, where she had walked in that extraordinary gown while the world held its breath. Cary Grant, her co-star in To Catch a Thief and one of the people who knew her best, was devastated in a way those around him said went deeper than most losses he had experienced. James Stewart said of her simply that she brought a soft, warm light into his life every time he saw her, and that every time he saw her was a holiday of its own. Prince Rainier never remarried. He died in 2005 at 81 and was buried beside her in the cathedral crypt. Stephanie, still recovering from her injuries, was unable to attend her mother's funeral. She spent years afterward carrying the complicated weight of having been in that car, the public speculation, the whispers, the impossible burden of survival. She later spoke about how people seemed to need someone to blame, and how that need sometimes turned toward her. She did not deserve it. But grief is not always reasonable in how it distributes itself. Elizabeth Ann Kelly was born on June 25, 1933, and everyone called her Liz Ann from the beginning. She was the youngest of the 4 Kelly children, the one Grace described as the family darling. She grew up in that 17-room house on Henry Avenue,